Welcome to our book group on the Rule of St Benedict. And this week we're looking at chapters 4 to 7, which are some really interesting chapters. And I hope you've had a chance to look at the questions beforehand, and also so you can muse on those questions as you've been reading. So this week, what I'd really like to do is have a look at what Benedict writes, which is a rule, and look at him within the context, a little bit of within the context of his time, because he wasn't writing in a vacuum at all. He was the heir to several centuries of Christian exploration into the spiritual life, and also a number of writings that had come out of that period. So we're going to have a look at the tradition that Benedict received from these different writings and rules, what he actually decided to put into his rule, and what he decided to leave out, and why Benedict is so crucial. Why is it that his rule endured and we don't know any of the others that were around? So that's what I thought we'd do today. So I think we have to locate ourselves, first of all, before we get to Benedict, in that early period of the Christian world, the Christian life, the Christian tradition. And from about the 3rd century onwards, Christians had sought very much different ways, radical ways, to live out the gospel message. So this comes after the period of persecution has come to an end. So there's no longer that witness in martyrdom as a primary path of sort of heroic witness, the sort of, so the kind of heroic movement whereby you expressed your faith, but also, expressed it within a time of persecution and were able to say, I believe, even though those around were actually trying to stamp out the faith of Jesus Christ. So after this period, once the Christianity had become like a sort of more of a state religion, gave rise to this sense of the witness and the heroic life as being one which moved into the deserts and moved into a kind of highly ascetic world. We have our hermits and our anchoresses and anchorites of that period. And we have loose communities of these different groups who gather together. I think I spoke about that earlier last week. We gather together around a teacher or a guru sort of figure. And they eventually then become structured into monasteries. But these early ascetics, if you think about them, were not governed at all by formal rules. Instead, they were governed by scripture, by the gospel word. They were influenced by the holy elders, so those who were living in the desert, who were able to impart their wisdom. And if you have ever read the sayings of the desert fathers and mothers, you'll see that there are lots of little sayings which are put in a kind of, a disciple comes and asks a question, and then the teacher will give an answer. And that's the way of learning, a very much a kind of experiential, but also listening to the master. And so informal customs would have been passed along orally, and certainly they weren't written down in a form of a rule. Instead, we have, as I say, those sayings of the desert fathers and mothers. One of the seminal texts, of course, around this time was the life of Anthony, written by Athanasius. And that was written actually much later, but it gives us an idea of what was going on and why people were so attracted to the great saints, I suppose, and the great spiritual wisdom that was being shared at this time. So the desert fathers and mothers in Egypt, in Syria, and in Palestine, they were much seen as foundational figures. What their spirituality really emphasized were a number of things. First of all, was solitude, finding God within the lone life of like being a hermit, of going into the desert and finding God. So being actually alone. Secondly, there was a radical self-denial, asceticism. Thirdly, it was this notion of constant prayer, not so much broken up into offices, but a constant way of praying. And Evagrius talks a lot about, how to pray without ceasing. And finally, there was the spiritual warfare against temptation. So if you went into the desert, you certainly had the devil to contend with. And I guess that was what's so important about the life of Anthony, is that he goes into his cell and battles with the temptations, and then he comes out a kind of new person, a new being. He's risen above and beyond those temptations by really going into them. So the strengths of this, the desert fathers and mothers, the real strengths that drew people to them, is this intense focus on the conversion of life, that holiness is seen in the way you live your life and the way you are dedicated to God. And it was an absolute dedication. And secondly, there was this sort of psychological insight into, the human mind, the human way of being, and what is it that draws us away from God, and really battling with that on a psychological level. And thirdly, there was an emphasis on humility and discerning within life where God is and where God is not. But the limitations of this sort of way of life, or the lack of a rule, I suppose, really, was there was very little guidance for communal organization. So people gathered round the kind of master, but there was nothing organized. It was a very loose kind of world. There was a real heavy reliance on the person, the master, and their charism that drew people towards them, as I say, in that sense of like being a guru, which has your disciples gathering around. And of course, there was also the potential for absolutely going too far, a real spiritual extremism. What's interesting is Benedict actually, he absorbs he has a great respect for the desert fathers and mothers, and he really absorbs some of the good things that comes out of that tradition. So, for example, the importance of humility, the importance of obedience, and the importance of listening to the abbot kind of figure. But what he does is he rejects their lack of structure. He says, life needs to have a structure, a routine, a way of being within. And he also, he sees the desert ideal of being domesticated into a form of a communal life. That what can be expressed and how it can be lived in these extremities can actually be open to an ordinary Christian within their communal life together. Benedict warns against asceticism and prefers instead a kind of obedience, a discipline towards a rule and an abbot, rather than personal heroic individualism. So it's quite different. It's very different from the Desert Fathers and Mothers, but that's where the whole tradition kind of begins. Then one of the very first communal rules is by one of those actual Desert Fathers, which is Pachomius. He writes in the 4th century, and he's often considered as the father of the kind of communal or cenobic monasticism. And his rule is governed by large communities in Egypt, which were sometimes numbering thousands. So bringing people together to follow a rule, to follow a way of life that is based on that of the fathers and mothers. What his simple rule gives is this highly regulated daily schedules. So maybe he goes a bit over the top. So highly regulated schedules. There's a kind of military-like obedience. And there's also, he brings in the uniform of what you wear and what you behave, and there's a very strong hierarchy. So the Pachomian rule treats monks almost like a spiritual army fighting against the forces of evil in this world, trained for discipline and efficiency, not only in their prayer life, but in the way their moral life as well. So obviously, we've already been reading a little bit of the Rule of St Benedict, and it doesn't feel like that at all in Benedict's rule. Instead, we have the sense of he takes from that rule, he takes from Pachomius the sense of stability, stable communal life together. But what he does is considerably soften what that looks like, how it is managed, hierarchy, and also the sense of kind of, the harsh military-like kind of discipline. And instead, he emphasizes discernment and moderation in all things. So once again, he moves away from the Desert Fathers and Mothers. Nothing is to be done in extreme. Benedict allows adaptation to circumstances, ages, and weaknesses. It's not like a very formal structure that's applied to everyone. Benedict takes into account where people are and allows different communities to adapt the rule for what works best to them. I think the other thing that he assumes, Benedict accepts, is that, there's going to be different people within a community, and he accepts that there's a human variety and that it's not about everyone having to come up to this high sort of spiritual level, but in a sense, the spirituality of God is revealed in each of the human characters and persons. What Benedict is very keen about is how do we perceive and know God within ourselves and amongst each other. And that is I suppose that's a much more realistic way of managing a community. And hence, Pachomius, it does not really, we don't know it today, for example. So another important rule that really shaped Benedict was around at this time. It started in the 4th century, and it's the rule of St Basil. Well, it's not quite a rule as such like we have. It's not a single text, but instead it's a series of questions and answers, responses, and responses to questions. So it's going back to that kind of the Desert Fathers and Mothers who often were giving their advice through conversation, through questioning. It emphasizes, though, the community life over the solitary asceticism. Obedience is seen as mutual service to each other. And the monastic life is seen as an extension of the Christian community. So the charity and care of the poor is seen as a very important part of Basil's rule. Now, Benedict echoes Basil in his insistence that monks live together under an abbot, but he differs in emphasis as Basil focuses more on the gospel charity and social responsibility, whereas Benedict concentrates on stability, order, and a daily rhythm. He keeps doing that. And it is a bit of a shift. And yet, when you look at medieval monasticism, you can see how it developed. I mean, you can just see how much of that social responsibility was then drawn into the Rule of St Benedict. So Benedict's rule has a flexibility to have that, understanding of looking out and caring, not only for those in the community, but also for those who come seeking help and advice. Basil's monks remain very outward facing, whereas Benedict's monks are enclosed, and they form a very distinct model. They're enclosed. So then if we move on to St Augustine, he also drew up a rule, and this rule was mainly used by clerics, and then later they were used by canons, Augustinian canons. You may remember Walter Hilton is one of those following this life. It's pretty short rule, and it's much more theological than it is practical. So it stresses, the unity of the mind and the heart, that all things should be held in common ownership, and that there is going to be correction for wrongs. Then integration then. So how that all works out is an integration of the prayer and the prayer life on the inside with your mind. So your prayer life is about your heart and all your mind. It also presumes quite a high level of spirituality and mutual goodwill, which is probably why it was used more by clerics than by lay people who came into it and you were forming a community. These are people who already, have made some kind of vows of a dedicated life, who then choose to live together. So comparison with Benedict's rule. So the Augustinian rule is actually quite idealistic, and again, it's very inward looking, whereas Benedict's rule is pragmatic and procedural. Benedict's rule focuses on the daily life, what you actually do, the bits and pieces of daily life. Augustine also assumes that charity will regulate behavior. Charity will regulate behavior. And also, whereas Benedict assumes that conflict will arise and that conflict must be managed wisely. So Benedict's genius is that he, rather than, as I say, assuming a perfection, he actually enables people to grow. He enables people to grow. So that's sort of the rule of St Augustine, which was also around at this time. Now, the great one who bridged the learning of the East with the West was John Cassian. John Cassian drew them together mainly through Latin translations and adaptations, which brought the work of the East into dialogue with Western Europe. And the key writings of his were the Institutes and the Conferences, and these were widely read in Italy and Gaul. And he brought that monastic wisdom to the Latin West. And it was his writings that deeply influenced Benedict. The major themes within Cassian's writing is that he managed to transmit the sort of spiritual, psychological understanding that Desert Fathers had about, the 8 vices, the 7 deadly sins, and the way that we are tempted, wrestle with temptations. He was able to bring all that understanding into his writing, and the sense of having a balance between the body and the soul, and that the most important of the virtues was discretion then, so you can understand where truth lies. So Cassian very much favoured moderation, but also he still envisaged a rigorous ascetic life. So what does Benedict do with Cassian? How does he use Cassian within his writings? Well, it's interesting that right at the end of Benedict's rule, he does say, go and read Cassian's writings. So it's clear that Benedict isn't seeing his rule as something absolutely complete in itself, but he gives the practical framework, which is within a larger tradition, and that the monk and the community is to also draw on those traditions. So he recommends Cassian's writings explicitly. He also adopts Cassian's emphasis on discretion, and Benedict, as we know, really lowers the ascetic bar, making the monastic life really accessible to ordinary people, not just kind of spiritual elite. So he does quite a lot with Cassian, which is important. But the text that really, really influenced Benedict most of all was what was called the Rule of the Master, which was written in the early 6th century. And actually, you can find that there are large portions of the Rule of the Master which are then found nearly verbatim in Benedict's rules. So he actually relies heavily on him. It's like the Rule of the Master, whoever has written it, is like a based text for him. It's the idea, the real source of his thinking about the monastic life really comes from this one rule. So it has most in common. So what's significant about the Rule of the Master? Well, first of all, it's much longer. It's much, much longer than Benedict's rule. It's also much more legalistic, and unfortunately, it's also much more punitive in its it's very severe on punishments, and it has a high authoritarian tone in it. And he really is, the Rule of the Master is obsessed by detailed regulation. So what Benedict does is he shortens, he softens, and he humanizes this material. So where the master threatens, Benedict will persuade. And where the master insists on perfection, Benedict allows for weaknesses and also for gradual growth. The comparison shows Benedict not so much as an innovator in content, but actually a master editor, someone who really understood human nature and what it means to live in community life. So those are the kind of what's going on around around the Mediterranean, I suppose, and Asia Minor, really. But also we must remember there was some rules over this way as well. You have the Irish monastic rules that were forming around this time, and one of the classic ones is by Columbanus. And in a sense, what's really interesting about his rule is about how strict and harsh it is. It's a bit like he's gone back to those original desert fathers and mothers and all the asceticism that they had and bring them into his understanding of the way of the spiritual life. So there are very harsh bodily penances, and there's frequent fasting, public confession, and also corporal punishment. So it's a pretty hard and harsh monastic rule. And these rules reflect a kind of penitential spirituality, which is shaped, as I say, by this heroic asceticism. Now, Benedict, as we said again, rejects all that kind of extremity, and he completely warns against excesses and insists how the abbot should adapt discipline to individual strength to enable growth, not to punish. So whereas Columbanus aims to forge saints through complete rigor, Benedict wants to sustain communities across generations. So what really distinguishes the Rule of Benedict is not so much its religiality, but its integration of diverse spiritual currents into a kind of stable, livable form. So the key elements that he takes forward in his rule, first of all, is moderation. Moderation in all things is seen as the supreme virtue by Benedict. The second is obedience, which is not so much strict do what I say, but it's about listening. It's not about submission, but about listening and working with. And then who makes the final decision, but then all sharing that and being part of it. Stability. So binding the monk to a place and to a people, and allowing that place and those people to then develop the rule into their community. And finally, there is the sanctification of ordinary time through the divine office and through manual labor, the rhythm of the life that Benedict. So unlike the dramatic asceticism of the desert or the penitential heroism of Irish monasticism, Benedict offers a spirituality of faithfulness to the ordinariness of the things in life. His monks aren't to be spiritual athletes, but they are to be lifelong apprentices, or what we would call today lifelong learners. So why does Benedict endure? Well, you can hear just in those points why he endures. He has this enduring way of actually having some factors, having factors which are going to enable community life to flourish and grow, rather than enforcing people to kind of live with each other. So he balances authority with compassion. He creates communities which are capable of self-reflection and self-perception. So who works well, and, who needs some kind of correction, given a second chance, all those kind of things allows the community to see God within each other. He harmonizes prayer, work, and reading. So there's a wonderful balance to life, the inner life and the external life. And it's flexible enough to be adapted without individual monks losing their identity. Also, Benedict never claims perfection for his rule. He says at the end, this is a little rule for beginners. Yet that humility may be precisely why it succeeded. It doesn't demand saints from the outset, but it helps people to grow slowly. So that's just a little introduction to what was around at the time, and also what was Benedict taking into his rule, but also what he was modifying to make his rule quite unique, but also one that would last.